I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the New America Foundation to this policy forum, which we call Google Unwired. My name is Michael Calabrese. I'm the director of the Wireless Future program at the New America Foundation. And it's great to see such a large and distinguished audience here. I know you've all come to see me, but I'll definitely give this gentleman a chance in a moment. In fact, this audience is actually much larger since we are webcasting live, and we'll be taking questions later, quite a few questions actually, both from this audience and from viewers who are using the interactive feature of our webcast. And I'd like to thank actually the Berkman Center for a widget that allows people online to vote up questions they like, although a fair warning that we'll be ignoring questions that aren't relevant to the topic today. Our speaker today is one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs, a high-tech visionary who I believe has drawn this audience in part because he rarely comes to Washington. In fact, I'm quite sure Larry would rather be kite surfing somewhere like St. Lucia on the white spaces there rather than talking about them here in Washington. But he has a mission. And Larry, as everyone knows, is the co-founder and first CEO of Google, a job that he, I think, wisely passed along to Eric Schmidt, who will become the chairman of the board of New America Foundation in just a couple weeks, actually. In less than a decade, Google has gone a long way toward achieving the rather modest goal that Larry and Sergey Brin set out as graduate students at Stanford, and that is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. In fact, just yesterday I read in a report by the National Association of Secondary School Principals that in rural Cambodia, the first English word that children learn is Google. I'm not sure that's English, but they believe it is. And when they can get online, the reason is when they get online, Google is their portal to the world, one that is in particular demand for looking up their favorite Brazilian soccer stars. So the world is I think, shrinking around these things. Larry is here today to talk about an equally ambitious goal of his that also happens to be central to the mission of our program at New America, and that is pervasive connectivity. To make the internet itself accessible and affordable anywhere and anytime through ubiquitous broadband networks. He's in Washington to meet with FCC commissioners and congressmen and to tell them and you today that to realize that vision, we need to change the way we allocate and manage our nation's public airwaves. I know firsthand that Larry has taken a very personal interest in spectrum and open access issues, and that he is the driving force within Google and with respect to his recent activism in this area. He's helped lead Google's efforts over the past year to pry open both unused TV airwaves and closed cellular networks to promote wireless broadband competition and consumer choice. This commitment by Google and a few other high-tech companies has made a real difference in this debate. When New America began advocating for the reallocation of empty TV spectrum from broadcasting to broadband back in 2002, there was very little Silicon Valley support. Today, 2 rulemakings later, the FCC is, we hope, in the final stages of putting the beachfront spectrum to work for broadband and innovation. And if they do, it will be thanks to what is now a very broad-based public interest and high-tech coalition that includes not only the national consumer, education, and civil rights groups, but also Google, Microsoft, Philips, and a few other leading companies. Larry, I have quite a few questions for you, and I know the audience does, but would you like to share some of your thoughts about why you're so focused these days on spectrum and wireless?
Sure. Well, after that, I'm not sure I need to say anything. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here and online, too. This has definitely been a passion and something I think is really important. I'm glad everybody's here this morning. I just wanted to really I know a lot of you have been instrumental in getting us to where we are today with white spaces, and I really want to thank everybody that has been involved in that. I think we're actually, we've made a lot of progress in a difficult and important area for the world. Now, you mentioned briefly our mission. So our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful at Google. And the accessible part is really what's gotten us into wireless. It actually doesn't do any good to have Google if you can't use it. And that's actually true for a large, for almost all the population stuff. I was recently in rural Uganda, and I'm trying to travel a lot to Africa as part of some of our philanthropic efforts. And we sort of barged into a classroom, and there's a bunch of kids actually learning trigonometry, which is pretty impressive. They were pretty young. And we asked them, how many of you have used cell phones? About a third of them raised their hands. And that's about the penetration of cell phones there, which is amazing. And that's a very recent phenomenon. Then we asked them, how many of you have used the internet? And actually the translator couldn't translate it. They didn't know what the internet was, that didn't translate as a word, and they had no access at all. And you think about that, they're sitting there with I'm sitting here with a BlackBerry, I have my notes on. They're sitting there with a telephone that's really a computer. And that telephone's connected to the phone network, which is connected to the internet. But they can't do a simple web search, which would probably be pretty revolutionary for somebody who's in rural Uganda. So I think there's a huge opportunity still to get connectivity to people, and to get specifically broadband, basic service, kind of a megabit or something like that, to people. And I think that that's going to really continue to change the world, especially in places like that. And I think we, as the US, have the opportunity to really trailblaze here. What we do with things like Wi-Fi and so on makes it very, very cheap. There's probably 1 billion Wi-Fi devices that have been produced. I don't know the exact number, but every laptop, and so on. And so the cost of Wi-Fi has gone down to about, $5 a chip or something like that. And that's why it's in every laptop. And so the technologies that we make standard, or we get policies around, very quickly end up in the rest of the world, and that has a huge impact on those places. And it really matters that there's large quantities. Now, all of you probably, I see some people here with laptops, you're probably using Wi-Fi. How many people have used Wi-Fi? Raise your hand. I assume it's everybody. How many people use it, at least once a week? Raise your hand. So it's a very, very large number. The history of that spectrum actually is that everybody thought it was useless because it's used for microwave ovens. And occasionally you close your microwave oven door too hard or something like that. It's a little bit dented. And your microwave oven actually leaks. And it leaks at 2.4 gigahertz, which is the 2.4 megahertz, which is the, or gigahertz, sorry, which is the frequency that Wi-Fi uses. And so basically everybody thought that was worthless, and so it became unlicensed spectrum. And amazingly, we had some brilliant engineers figure out how to use it to send huge amounts of data reliably for computers. Now that's probably the standard use now of that frequency. I think that shows the value to the world of having this unlicensed regime. People's creativity is amazing. The march of computers and electrical engineering and all this radio engineering has been quite incredible. And the use that we can make of the spectrum when we have open to innovation and so on is quite amazing, and you can see that already with Wi-Fi. Now, I think since 2001, the U.S. has gone from about third in broadband penetration to 16th, which is kind of, I think, a real travesty for a country as rich as ours. And I think white spaces, the television white space, has a real potential to help that. I like to think of it as Wi-Fi on steroids. If you think about Wi-Fi right now, it has a pretty limited range. A lot of times, like I was in my hotel last night, I could get Wi-Fi, but they go into a lot of trouble to install it in the hotel and make it work and so on. They probably needed an access point, many per floor to cover the hotel. If we use TV white spaces for that same thing, we could probably do it much more cheaply and still with high data rates and high connectivity. And that would make a huge difference. You would see it in a lot more places. And that alone, I think, is enough reason to do something like this. I think it'll make a huge difference to everybody. But I think the other thing is that, especially in like a rural area or something like that, you can really get a lot more range with the 700 megahertz kind of bands we're talking about for TV white spaces. That will make a huge difference to those people. You know, imagine you're kind of living in the middle of nowhere and your neighbor gets internet. They live 3 miles away or something. But you know, Wi-Fi is pretty difficult. You have to set up a dish. That's what people do now. With TV white space, you could probably just put up a normal antenna and help your neighbor out and give them connectivity. And those kind of things are really important. And by the way, the cost will be similar. There's no like increase in cost for that. You'll just have greater range. Now, there's been a lot of concern about interference and so on in the press and in the political debates. I'm really saddened by that, being an engineer, because I think that the debate's really been politicized. We're not really dealing with the reality of the situation. In fact, many of the people who complain about interference are the ones who should be causing interference, such as the people who make this microphone I'm using. So this microphone that I'm using right now actually uses TV white spaces. And in fact, it's probably, it's broadcasting on some TV channel right now. And amazingly, nobody in the room is upset that they can't watch TV on that channel, given that nobody's watching TV. But also, it's pretty, it's a small amount of power and so on, and there's been, millions and millions of these things produced, and there's been very few complaints. And in fact, they're supposed to be licensed, and they're generally not licensed. There's, a very small number of license holders relative to the number of those produced. In fact, I have one that's not licensed at home. So, but I think that actually proves the point that you can have a huge amount of use of the spectrum without causing any interference, which is the opposite point of the people who are making these products use. Now, there's also been a lot of press and so on about testing of the white space devices. We had a pretty ambitious technical plan to show something called spectrum sensing. And that's a very important thing because probably 3 to 5% of the spectrum is in use at any given time. If I run a spectrum analyzer in this room right now, we can actually look at all the frequencies that are really in use. And that, we've actually done this. We carry one around sometimes. It's a lot of fun to look at. And, the averages are something like 3 to 5%. And spectrum is not like water. It's not like if we don't use it, there's some benefit. I mean, once we don't use it, it just is gone. And there's no conservation or anything needed in spectrum. By not using it, there's a great resource that we're just not using. And the reason is that when we decided how to allocate spectrum, we didn't have computers. And now we have computers, and we can say things like, oh, you can use my spectrum, but only if I'm not using it. You can implement a rule like that that just says, if the spectrum's empty, you can go ahead and use it. And if I want to use it, I'll preempt you. You won't be able to transmit, but by the way, there's the other 97% that's not being used. So I think that's a huge opportunity for our economy, for communications in general, and just for kind of efficiency and so on. Now, I think the white spaces is a great path towards that use of that spectrum. That's why everybody was excited about doing this. It's not technically trivial to do that, but if I were to bet on it happening or not, I'd bet 100% that it will happen. It's just a question of what year it happens in. So basically the politicization around the testing, that's what happened. People working hard on testing things for things like microphones being in use and so on, which is a fairly hard problem but achievable. And these were small efforts in companies. We had probably 5 people who were working on that. There were similar efforts in the other technology companies. And they didn't quite work as they were expected. These were prototype devices. And that's, in fact, there's a bunch of devices produced and they worked in different ways. Some of them did some things and some of them did others, and that's fine. These were like, big boxes like this, with wires dangling out the side. They're not consumer products. They're really to make a point, not to be a real device. Now, before any device can actually be shipped, like your BlackBerry or something like that, it's thoroughly tested by the FCC. and shown to cause no interference. And that would be true for white space devices too. And obviously, if you're going to invest a lot in building a device, you want to actually know that you can produce it, that there are rules that let you produce that. And I'm totally confident that if we have rules that say you can use the spectrum under conditions that you cause no interference, that those devices will get produced. And in fact, hundreds of millions of dollars will be invested in making those devices non-interfering, rather than the 5 or so people we have working on it now. So those are kind of the main points I wanted to make. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, and those are good ones. I just want to follow up on this a bit by, or bring it back a little more generally, which is, Google has become steadily, more active in spectrum-related advocacy, particularly over this past year, much more, I think much more than most of, the high-tech companies. So I'm wondering, what explains, well, I think both, your personal interest as well as Google's, putting a priority on spectrum policy, where it seems like, other companies often aren't doing that.
Well, like I said, I think there's a huge opportunity here to make this stuff work better. And I think, by looking at laptops or something like that, you see the possibilities for unlicensed spectrum. And for us, even being a little bit selfish, that translates into more revenue for us. Like if we have 10% better connectivity in the US, we get 10% more revenue in the US. And those are big numbers for us. And in fact, we know this. The more available broadband is, the lower the cost and so on, we make more money because there's more access to the internet. And in fact, in places like the UK, which is actually significantly ahead of the United States in terms of monetization, you get more money per query, there's more access to broadband, there's more searches that happen. And that translates directly into a business outcome for us, which is better. So I think it makes sense along a number of dimensions.
Okay. So I'm told you're not announcing the G phone today,
no,
and
sorry.
You're not even going to get exclusive license rights to the white space, to these empty TV channels. But you still think it's really in the interest of the IT economy and companies like Google to open these up on an unlicensed basis, even though you have any special rights to?
No, that's right. It's unlicensed, so there's no rights at all. And I think that's good. I think the tiny sliver of spectrum we've given to unlicensed, which is the microwave oven band and a few other bands, that tiny sliver is doing a huge amount of work in spectrum. So I think it's really sensible to give a little bit more to that area. And I think there's a place for all these different things, but that can fill a big need for a lot of different uses.
So let's say the FCC reallocates the unused TV channels for unlicensed access. How do you see these TV white spaces being used to bring the internet to more people? What are some of the practical ways that this would actually increase broadband deployment in the US or bring down the cost of broadband?
Well, I think the great thing is that
need a new spectrum.
We need white space spectrum.
Yes.
I guess it's working good. All right. I think the great thing is that there's a lot of possibilities for how to do that. One is, we've been involved a little bit in municipal Wi-Fi. We actually we operate a network in Mountain View, California. It has something like 40,000 users. It's pretty significant compared to the size of the city. A very large number of people actually use it in the city. I think, so we've had some experience with that, and I think that'll make things like that much, much easier, as an example. So, the amount of radios that you need to cover a city will go down dramatically with the spectrum. That'll make it much more practical to do it. And I don't think it's a question, people sort of assume, oh, there's a cost to do this and it's not going to change much. As the technology improves, it changes radically. The cost for providing, 1 megabit to everyone, should decline as computers get better, basically. So, as Moore's law marches on and computers get, almost twice as good every 18 months, the cost of that, bandwidth that you're delivering to somebody should go down in proportion to that. And that's a big deal. That means 18 months from now it should be half the price, and then it should be half the price again, and twice as fast, or twice as fast. And we're not really on that path with networking. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but most of it's just not that much innovation, it's not that open, and so on. And so I think, being able to really have more range, have more speed, have open innovation, in a significant, band that's significant in terms of providing reasonable coverage and reasonable distance and reasonable speeds, which you can get out of TV white spaces, I think will be a really significant thing.
Yeah, it's a very good point about the number of access points, because one reason EDUCAUSE, for example, which represents the nation's universities on technology issues, there's some campuses that have thousands of access points to provide, great, fast coverage, and there's been studies that show that you would, need a fourth or a fifth as many access points, to provide the same coverage, especially in rural areas where you want to send a signal over long areas or in suburban areas. So it could, Earthlink found that out in Philadelphia, their costs to give good coverage were much higher because of the limited spectrum, the higher frequency spectrum they had to rely on. And if they had had, the good white space spectrum, it would have been a huge improvement.
Yeah, that's right. And I think also, you'll see people with interesting ideas about what to do. I saw a really old business plan, like a 10-year-old business plan to do a city-based internet access using an airplane. And they're actually using the unlicensed 2.4, but they had 200 spot beams all from that one airplane. And I think you'll see people do really interesting things like that, and it'll be a lot easier for them to do than if they have to go out and bid $4.6 billion and then wait a long time and see if they get the spectrum. It's a very difficult thing to do. I also think it's likely, if we do this, I think it's likely that, it'll become, there's good opportunity for it to become a worldwide standard like we have with Wi-Fi, where you have, pretty soon everybody adopts something similar and you have good worldwide coverage.
All right. Now, we like to think big, as you do, about covering, entire counties and cities, and a lot of that's happening in places like Vienna, Austria, with mesh networks. But what about, in sort of very practical terms for consumers and businesses? Like, what sort of new products and innovations would actually, could operate on the white space to help, just regular people at home and at work?
Well, I think the most obvious thing that would happen right away is just you would buy a Wi-Fi access point that was Wi-Fi on steroids, Wi-Fi 2.0, that just had TV white spaces built in and had much greater range and much greater speed. And it would also be built into your laptop. I think that would happen pretty quickly. And I don't know, how many of you have gotten a weak Wi-Fi signal? Raise your hand. That's, a pretty bad thing. So I think, and the odds that you will have a Wi-Fi signal, right? It's really high speed and so on, the Wi-Fi TV Plus on steroids, is going to go up a lot. You're going to have that a lot more of the time as you have more coverage. So I think that's a very, very significant, very obvious, very easy to do thing that would happen right away. I think people may try to combine those kind of things into real services, cover whole cities, whole countries, and so on. That's subject to what their business plans and so on. That may be more difficult because of the unlicensed nature. You're going to say, am I going to invest $10 billion to do something unlicensed? You have to really think about that, and that depends on how good the protocols end up being and how good people can share and coexist in that band. But that's quite possible. People will do things like that.
Yeah, and I know companies are already at work as well on things. When you think about the home, things like remote sensing, where very inexpensive little Wi-Fi type chips can be put in almost everything, appliances, heating, cooling systems, sprinkler systems, and aggregate information that you can use to control your life even from around the world. So, another, in addition to education groups like EduCause, a number of cities have been big supporters of opening the white space, not only for muni Wi-Fi, but for public safety, first responders. Like the city of Corpus Christi, Texas, has been to Washington a number of times to lobby for this because of the the public safety network that they've created. Why is this useful for first responders?
Well, I think with the white spaces, you really have an opportunity to build something that's very distributed, like the internet is. The internet was designed to survive a nuclear holocaust. That's why it was built originally by DARPA. And as a result, it's this very decentralized, very distributed, very bottoms-up kind of thing. Our wireless networks aren't like that at all. In fact, in Katrina, a lot of people's phone records were present in some database that got knocked out. And even when they left the area, they still couldn't use their phones because their database records were sitting in an underwater computer. That's not great. I think with kind of the more ad hoc networks like Wi-Fi, they're not centralized. You don't have that problem. Your database record doesn't exist in some computer. It's a completely distributed thing, and it works much more like the internet. Everybody creates capacity as they need it, and so on. And I think those kind of networks are much more resilient and much more able to really provide services in times of distress. If everybody has their own completely self-sufficient, network access point, and you're able to use, anybody's access point, because people generally share them, that's a lot more resistant to disaster than if you have one centralized thing that does billing and so on. So I think there's a lot of benefit there for those kind of things. And I also think you'll see devices that can talk to each other. Why can't your cell phone talk to another cell phone? If you're both in the woods, why can't you dial your friend or your family member? Right? That's really dumb. Actually, it's a minor change to the software on the phone to allow it to do that. The reason why that doesn't work is because those things are designed primarily, to do billing and go through the centralized thing, rather than just provide communications. There's no technical reason why you can't do that. And I'd actually really like to see a sort of a communication cell phone system that was designed, to survive disasters and to be resilient and to operate even if there are no base stations. It's possible to do that.
At the beginning, you mentioned the concerns about interference. So if I could come back to that for a minute. The TV broadcasters have argued, from the beginning, that allowing unlicensed use of the empty TV channels, the white space, will inhibit the success of the DTV transition next February. Is that true? I mean, is there some reason why we can't make this transition from analog to digital only if we allow broadband to share the broadcast bands?
No, I don't think there's any technical credence to that at all. Again, I think before any device can be produced and shipped, it needs to be certified that it doesn't cause interference. And I think the FCC actually has a great record on that. I think they do a really good job of making sure that those kind of interference problems very, very seldom occur in practice. And there's great engineering also around that to make sure of that. So I think that's really a very much imagined and created fiction. And in fact, I was reading actually the NAB has also in the past complained about things like satellite broadcasting causing interference, which is absolutely ridiculous thing, and obviously wasn't true. We have that; it doesn't interfere. So I think, I think there's obviously, people pay attention to that because they say it, but that doesn't mean it's true.
Okay. Well, Skim, in particular, I know the broadcasters, just are adamant that there's this intolerable risk of interference to the 12 or 13% of homes that are still, relying on over-the-air TV. So I'm wondering if you could just explain a little bit more, a little bit more specifically what the FCC could do. What are the sort of technologies that would help ensure that white space devices operate only on empty channels without interfering with viewers?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, if you turn your TV, like there's an awful lot of empty channels in any given place, and you know that there are actually good reasons for that. But in any case, you know, it's not that those empty channels change every day, right? I mean, you know which ones are empty, and they stay empty for a long time. And if you have a device, it hasn't moved much. It's not that hard to tell which ones are empty. So we actually proposed a pretty simple scheme, which is just that the devices know roughly where they are in the world, called geolocation. And based on that, they have a database of all the channels and where they get it over the internet. And that makes sure, no matter what, you know where the device is and you know where the channels are around that. We maintain a database of that. There's no way for it to broadcast on a used channel. Of course, this microphone here has no such, does the same thing and has no such technology. So it's obviously much more dangerous, and we shouldn't allow them. But we do, there's millions of them. But we propose that as a pretty completely fail-safe way of doing it. And I think there's a lot of support for that in the coalition. And I think and that's a very easy and very practical way to do it that's totally understandable.
Yeah, and I believe there's already, devices out operating on the spectrum that use sensing and the listen before talk protocol. I mean, isn't it true that the U.S. Department of Defense already is allowing broadband devices to share military radar spectrum on an unrestricted, that is on an unlicensed basis? So, shouldn't that really mean it's just a question of time to be sure that this works on the TV bands as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the military obviously does a lot of things like this. Spectrum is very important to them. But I think, again, there's a lot of opportunity here for these things. And, I part of why I'm here is I don't want people to be misled by, people who have interests in this to, cause the country to do the wrong thing. That really bothers me. So I'm here kind of to take a stand on that and say, should you really be listening to the NAB, which wants to keep the spectrum for its own use, has all these other interests? They obviously have a reason to be pushing that agenda.
Larry, in March, Google offered what it called an enhanced spectrum protection proposal that involved the use of beacons and geolocation. Could you explain that a little more? Because I think sometimes it's been misunderstood what you all are asking for at this point from the FCC.
Yeah, we found there's all this debate going on in the press and so on. People are saying, oh, this stuff will never work, blah, blah, blah. So we just took the position, hey, you don't even need any of the things that we should be doing, like the sensing. And we'll just have a very pragmatic and practical approach to get this done. And the way we propose that for these microphones, which there are a lot of, is just say that you have a beacon basically that you turn on when you're going to use one of the microphones, and it broadcasts a signal basically that says don't trounce on the microphone. And this would probably be like a $50 thing. It wouldn't be a big deal. This microphone tend to be hundreds of dollars. Protect all the microphones in the area, and would be really, really fail-safe. Like broadcast a really easy to detect signal, and it worked fine. And so, in fact, you don't even need to test it. Like everybody believes that will work. Any engineer you ask this question would tell you that it would work fine. So we propose that as sort of a way to deal with all this concern about this, and I think we're busy working on getting that through.
Yeah. Well, you don't come to Washington much. You're more diplomatic than I am, because I would note that 95% of those wireless microphones are operating illegally. Anyway, they're on the band without a license that you need to be there, and I think that is a good compromise to, that they can certainly, if they're having any interference problems or they're worried about it, protect themselves by turning on this little device, which engineers have told me could be even more like $20 or $25. So all it has to do is send a simple signal, and at a sport, like at a high school football game or something, it would look to somebody in the audience as if there was a broadcast tower on the 50-yard line, and they simply wouldn't use those channels.
Yep.
Okay. So, from what you're describing, I mean, if your proposal, if the FCC goes ahead with an order that allows unlicensed access for both fixed and mobile devices on a limited basis, perhaps requiring geolocation for now, if that's the comfort level that's needed, does that mean Google is giving up on the technical feasibility of devices that rely on sensing alone? The sort of peer-to-peer devices that wouldn't need necessarily to have GPS or access, all the time to the internet?
And I think what our proposal was, I don't remember the exact details, but it's more that they have you basically have the possibility to do geolocation as it's proved. Spectrum sensing as it's proved out. So you simply say, we have these things that are very simple and practical. You know where you are, you know what TV stations are in the area. That's a totally simple, brain-dead thing to do. But as you get technologies that can reliably detect that, as you move around and detect other things like microphones and so on, you can use those things. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that can get us on a path where we're using 99% of our spectrum rather than 3%. Right? So that's a really important thing, I think, to have in there.
Okay. I'd like to take you back for a minute to what you mentioned about, Muni Wi-Fi and community wireless, because that's something in New America that we're probably, most excited about. In fact, next week, we're having an international summit on community wireless networking next Thursday and Friday, bringing people from around the country and around the world who've been doing this. And a few years ago, Google started experimenting with these meshed community networks by launching a pilot that put a free Wi-Fi network over all of Mountain View, 1 megabit symmetrical, I believe, which is, of course, where the Google Plex is located, your headquarter town. What lessons has Google learned about Muni Wi-Fi or community wireless from that experiment?
Well, I think in the U.S., we actually tried to do it in Mountain View and San Francisco at the same time, and the San Francisco one has never gotten done. We basically offered to do it for free, and we just kind of wanted to experiment with it and see how it worked and learn about this kind of stuff. And so that, I think what that tells you is that, and I think this is true in a lot of the wireless area, is that the politics and the regulatory issues and the, who's backhaul using, blah, 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 those kind of issues are the primary issues. It's not technical issues. If you could wave your hand and just say, you have access to light poles in the whole U.S. You can rent them at a reasonable cost. You'd have a lot more of these things. You didn't have to talk to anybody. Because right now you're going to have to talk to 100,000 different people. You have to talk to the power companies and the different people. Anyway, it's very, very complicated. So I think a lot of this is about access to public resources, right-of-ways, power. Literally we're getting into it like over how you're going to meter these things and things like that, which is very, they lose so much power, you can just estimate it and pay the amount, right? Fine to pay more than the amount. But the regulatory burdens there are very, very high. So I personally think a lot more of this stuff will get done if we had, just some thought given to it and how we want to regulate it and how we want to let people do things like this. Because for us, we have money we can invest and so on, and we'd probably do it at a larger scale if we thought you could do it in a reasonable amount of time. But I think that's a difficult issue. So I think these things will happen, and they make a lot of sense, and especially if we get devices with more range, like the white spaces devices. I think it'll become even much more practical. But that network we operate is pretty good, even as it is with today's technology. Remember, next year there'll be better technology with better range and better data rates and so on.
Right, and I think in practice too, we need to get back to more of a mindset of public investment in infrastructure, because because it takes something like a simple anchor tenancy or a public safety network, places like Minneapolis, Corpus Christi, St. Cloud, Florida, to make these things work right. So with the spectrum and with a little bit of public will, I think that there would be a future for that. Let me ask you about this auction that just occurred. All this talk about white space that we've had is really about all of the empty channels that will remain between what are today channels 2 and 51. Because, under current law, that still remains exclusively for broadcasting, all of it, even though there's only an average of 7 or 8 high-power channels in use after the ETV transition. But channels 52 to 69 were just auctioned or given to public safety, raising nearly $20 billion. Why did Google, it seemed strange to people at the time, but why did Google decide to bid in that auction? Would Google conceivably become a wireless operator someday, or was it trying to accomplish something else?
Well, we did. So we actually bid $4.6 billion, and we were actually the winner of that C block for a weekend. So we had a long weekend that weekend. But I think we were very serious about having openness conditions applied to the wireless spectrum, and the reason is that we really have a lot of issues. Like, if we want to make an application work on your phone, we just go through all sorts of hurdles. It's not like making something work on the internet or your PC where it's pretty open. We would make things that just let you, for example, do something as simple as take a picture on your phone and upload it. We have the Picasa service, Picasa Web, that lets you, host photos on the web. And we'd have the carriers telling us, oh, you can't do that. And we're like, well, it works fine. Why can't we do it? And they're like, well, we have a photo app we want to charge for, so you guys can't do that. You can imagine, if you want to know why your phone doesn't work very well, this is why. Is this kind of control, this kind of attitude that, we're going to restrict what kind of functionality you can have on your device, and we're going to charge for it. Or we're going to, just keep it for ourselves or whatever. And so we believe strongly in having open competition on these devices and having an open environment to run applications and so on. We think that's really important. It's also good for our business, obviously. So there's self-interest there too. But we feel pretty strongly that having access to consumers by anyone is a good thing. That's how we got started, and that's how all the innovation happens on the internet and so on. So much like we want to have an open internet, we also want to have open wireless networks, meaning that you can run applications, that you can run new kinds of devices. Because I have another microphone. The telephone network also had this issue that we had the old Bell phones, the rotary phones, and they claimed forever that if you attached anything else besides their phones to the network, you would blow up their network and it would never work. And that, of course, turned out not to be true. And then we got fax machines, and then we got modems, and then we got the internet as a result of that. That's very, very important to be able to attach any device to the network and run any application on it. And so we believe strongly in that. And we spend a lot of time with the FCC, and thank you. We spent a lot of time with the FCC, and we got these provisions attached to the C block. But in order to do that, we had to say we were pretty serious about it, and we said that's fine. We'll be happy to buy wireless spectrum at a reasonable price with openness conditions applied, because we think we can make a good business of that, and we'll put our money where our mouth is. That doesn't mean that we want to be a wireless carrier, right? It just meant that we were willing to push that pretty far, and I think, like I said, for a weekend we were the owner of that spectrum, and I'm sure we'd find something good to do with it.
Okay, but although in the end, Google was outbid by Verizon for that C block spectrum, which had the open, what we call sometimes wireless Carter phone. Carter phone, the rules would allow consumers choice to attach any device, use any application on a wired phone system, has those conditions. So given that, given the outcome of the auction, what do you think the significance will be? Will it make much difference now that the nation's largest carrier, Verizon, has this this very great spectrum that has this condition, and yet that's just one part, maybe 10% of the spectrum that's in the hands of the carriers as they march toward 3G and 4G services. The FCC apparently is going to dismiss the Skype petition. Skype filed a petition to impose these, try to get these consumer choice protections on all of the wireless broadband spectrum. So do you think this auction will make a difference nevertheless?
Yeah, I think it'll definitely make a difference. And I think, this is kind of, there's kind of a tipping point argument, and I think there's a number of things going on that really have helped. One is actually the iPhone, which has been a great device, and everybody wants to have that kind of functionality. And obviously you can install, they're working on the program to let you install apps. It's not totally open, but it'll be more open than the things we have now. We have something called Android, which is a completely open source, completely open phone operating system. And that's getting a lot of interest, and the carriers are all interested in that and so on. And I think that will also help to change the environment. So I think things are actually moving in a great direction. I think it could kind of tip either way, and I think it's definitely tipping towards open right now.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to ask you next. Is if looking out ahead, I mean, do you believe it's inevitable that the wireless world is becoming, or as we move into 3G and 4G services, will it become more open and internet-like, or could things still trend in a more closed direction, where carriers win this argument, perhaps that they need to monetize the internet in order to justify, their infrastructure build?
I mean, I think we're spending a lot of effort on this because we're very concerned about this, both in the wireless space and in the internet space. You have similar kinds of things happening with traffic shaping on the internet, and basically, when Google started, I remember we were about 20 people. And we had several million customers all around the world. And we actually accidentally put our phone number up, and we couldn't function. The phone just rang continuously, and we couldn't even answer it. So we took our phone number back down, because we were 20 people and millions of customers. And was the power of the internet, is that, a couple of people, you plug something into the internet, and it works everywhere in the world, the next day. And there's a lot of people trying to break that functionality, which has really made the internet work. And they want to only deliver then your packets at really low speed and really unreliably, unless you pay each carrier in the world money, right? And that's just not practical. It's much better for innovation, for new companies coming along. They don't have to have a relationship with every internet carrier in the world in order to launch their product. That's not what the internet's about. That's not why we've had stuff that works, right? We've had stuff that works because everybody tries to make it work as best they can. So I think maintaining these principles is really, really important. It's important for us not to forget what's caused the innovation and all the interesting things to happen in the world, and make sure we keep on everybody to keep relatively open systems and so on.
You mentioned at the very beginning that, on any given place or time, there's only something like 3 to 5% of the spectrum, of the good spectrum even, that's really being used. And I think that's part of what is wrong with what's been the conventional wisdom in Washington, that there's spectrum scarcity, when in fact what's scarce is government licenses to use the spectrum, as opposed to the bandwidth itself, which is actually quite abundant. And we do the same thing of measuring from our rooftop in DuPont Circle over the White House, in that direction, probably the most, wireless congested area, things that we aren't even supposed to know about. And it was, less than half in use. So what sort of problems, when you look at it from in terms of innovation and from a business perspective, what sort of problems are there with the way that the government continues to allocate access to the airwaves, the way we do it now?
Well, I know there's a movement in some governments to really charge, a budget line item every year for spectrum, and I think that's really a good idea. Sort of force accountability in that area. I think part of the issue is that we're allocating spectrum by selling it sort of one time. That's the de facto way we're doing it. It's not legally that way, but de facto, you pay for the spectrum and you sort of get it from that point on. And the argument is that there's, you're making so much investment in devices that you need to do it that way. I think that's not really true anymore, because we have computers, we actually have radios that can talk over very wide bands of spectrum. So, all the different frequencies at once, over very wide ranges. And actually, if you made that a standard, again, those things would cost $5. I mean, engineers figure out a way to make, a really wideband radio that's really cheap, because everybody would use one. And so, if you have every radio able to talk on every frequency, then it doesn't make so much sense to say that your spectrum is protected forever. That doesn't make any sense, in fact. And so, you start to have a regime where maybe, if I was the government, I would say, I want to auction my spectrum, but I want to do it every second. Which is actually what we do with our ads. That's how we make so much money. We, every single search on Google is auctioned separately. And in the same way, every single piece of spectrum, a given frequency in this room at this time, what's the demand for it? Is it high? Is it low? Well, it depends what people are doing and what the applications are. And I would suspect the government can make a lot of money every second, auctioning the 97% unused, auctioning that off every second. And it's very possible to do that. So I do think there's a basic disconnect. Now that we have computers, now that we have devices able to talk over wide frequencies and to switch very, very quickly, it means I can pick any frequency that's not in use and use it for whatever I'm trying to do. And there's some demand for that at that given time. So that would be the most extreme version, I think, of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. The term white space has become associated, right now in Washington with the debate over the empty TV channels. But actually, there's so much more unused and underutilized spectrum. Much of it, whether it's the federal government, actually probably has the most, and then many legacy licensees that is used only in limited geographic areas or for limited times, or with antennas pointing in one direction, not another, high up in the air or not on the ground.
Let me give you a more palatable way of accomplishing this politically. Is you could say everybody in the government who owns spectrum, we're going to build a set of regulations that let them real-time auction their spectrum when they're not using it, so they still have priority. They can turn off the other users at any time they want. In a millisecond, they can just turn them off. And they get the revenue from them. So, you turn it around and say, oh, they're sitting on, $10 billion worth of spectrum per year. Why don't they get that $10 billion per year from people who want to use it for stuff, and they still have all the rights that they have now? It just doesn't say wasted.
So, do you see that, this real-time auction pricing, that Google has shown can work in other contexts? Do you see that primarily as an insurance policy in case of congestion, or do you think it's really, politically speaking, probably perhaps needed as an incentive so that license holders open up their bands?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I think you are going to have, you do need some way of deciding who gets to transmit. So, and I don't think money is a bad way to do that. That's sort of a rough estimation of what you think the value of what you're trying to do is. You need some way also to force people to be efficient, not to broadcast to higher powers than they need to, and so on. And I think that's a pretty good way to accomplish that. That doesn't mean, it's unclear how much demand you have. I think you'll have a lot of demand as you free up more spectrum and you actually have many more uses and so on. But it's hard to know exactly, but I think it's a pretty good way to adjudicate between the real needs of folks. And pretty good way to estimate the real economic costs. If I have a cost of spectrum, which is say I have $100 cost of spectrum I'm paying in this room every day for my access point that I'm letting people use. And if I instead install 2, then I only pay $30 in spectrum access. The access point costs me $50. You want some way to trade that off. And as you add more cells or more access points, the power you need to transmit goes down, and the amount of spectrum you're using goes down, the interference goes down. And so you want to trade off somehow how much hardware you're installing versus the cost of the spectrum that you're using. And that's going to tend to go down as you spend more on hardware. So if you have a real economic system, you can have the economy do the most efficient thing. put in the right amount of hardware and use spectrum when it's available and use hardware when it's not.
Let me just ask one more question and then open it up about something that's in the news, which is Clearwire. Why did Google invest $500 million alongside cable and Intel in the new Clearwire venture? Do you view WiMAX as potentially competing with wired ISPs, at least for some period of time until fiber is widespread, or is it primarily competition for the incumbent wireless carriers?
I mean, I think Clearwire, we're excited about Clearwire, and I think they have tremendous spectrum assets. They have a huge amount of spectrum, and it's not the best propagation. It doesn't go through walls that well, but it's a lot of spectrum. So I think you have the opportunity, and they already have service working, like for example in Seattle. So you can go try it out there. But you basically can get very high data rates if you have, if you're near the outside of a building, you'll be able to get extremely high data rates. And I think, there's a lot of value in that. Intel's, really excited about putting it into laptops and so on. So you have a lot of laptops with a lot of, very high speed access to a network. Coverage might not be quite as good as you get in the lower bands, but when you have coverage, it's built into your computer and you have great data rates, and it's over a wide area, like a whole city. So I just think there's a lot of value in that. They've been very open about making it a completely open kind of thing, and so we're excited about that and want to support it. And I think we feel like, again, having more access is good for our business, and so it makes a lot of sense for us to have more access choices. So we're excited about that too.
Is there an agreement that Clearwire will respect the sort of openness conditions that Google advocated for the C block, such as all the different developers building on your Android platform, that consumers will be able to choose those devices?
Yeah, I think absolutely it's going to be an open network, and I think it will stay that way. I think, and I think also the management of Clearwire is very progressive in this area.
Okay, great. Well, we will let's open it up for questions, which will come both from this audience and also from the web. And what we'll do is kind of alternate. When is it? Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll get the microphone in place. But be sure that you identify yourself as far as your name and your organizational affiliation. And Troy Schneider up here, our new media director at New America, is going to speak for the empowered but voiceless web viewers. And so we'll kind of alternate. Troy, you can kind of raise your hand maybe when there's a good one that has gone up. But I think we have one already.
If you're affiliated with the NAB, please identify yourself.
No, but I am Scott Cleland, and I'm with netcompetition.org, and I'm affiliated with Broadband companies. And you mentioned the word accountability a minute ago, and I was curious, just a very brief question, is net neutrality include the concept of accountability? And if it does, in what way and to whom?
Well, it's a little bit hard to know exactly what that means. I think I prefer to call it open internet rather than net neutrality. But I think there's been people who've been running pretty interesting tests. So they're able to detect things like exactly what kind of applications are being slowed down. So if you look at the issues with Comcast and so on, you can sort of run a particular application. You can tell that that particular application is being slowed down as opposed to other applications to do similar things. And so I think that's how you're going to generate accountability, is people actually have figured out very clever ways to test the networks and how they're discriminating against different kinds of things. Now, there is a real need to be able to, people to operate networks and to make them run reliably and so on. So there's legitimate things that people need to do. But there's also, if they're targeting a very particular application, that's just to be more problematic, because they can target that kind of traffic rather than that particular application. And I think that's a lot more reasonable way to do it. Yeah.
Well, we should get one from the web, and then Drew Clark after.
Several of the people who are watching the live stream we're very interested in the WiMAX question. I think we addressed that. Another one that came up in several different forms was the question of whether the spectrum policy is, whether Google's focused on opening it up in the US, or are you trying to push the same type of approaches globally? And then there was one other sidebar to that, asking if the Google Foundation was investing any of its money into trying to expand broadband access in development.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, one of the things we've been brainstorming about, I'll just kind of throw this out, this isn't as well developed, but is to have, we have google.org, which is our philanthropic arm, and we really, before we went public, we put about 1% of our stock in there, which is several $billion. And we've been targeting developing world specifically with that as one of the areas. And we started thinking about the kind of things we could have a lot of impact on, and we decided communications is pretty important. I mentioned that example in Uganda already. But it's really nice for people in places like that to have, like a megabit of reliable connectivity, and that would really change their lives. And it also, the nice thing about it is it actually might be cheap to provide if you do it properly. And so we've been thinking about that issue a lot. And again, we feel like the barriers are not technical so much as regulatory and protectionist and so on. So, what if you said, we're gonna start a charitable thing that's gonna provide communications as a basic human right for people, and it's gonna cover the entire planet with broadband, basic level. And maybe it funds that by, providing 1 megabit for free, maybe they charge for 10 megabits or something like that. Use that to recover the cost provided for the one. Maybe the regulatory environment all of a sudden changes if you're doing that. You're saying, well, you're really standing not for having everybody in my country having a 1 megabit free broadband service that works well. That starts to be politically harder to fight, right? So I think this is a very interesting area to think about, because I think communications is something that certainly we as Americans, if we provided communications to the world or helped to make that happen, maybe our reputation will go up instead of down in the world, as it has been, which I think is a big issue. So I think we should be looking for areas like that where we could have a big impact. I'm optimistic that sort of engineers and clever people can figure out ways to provide those kind of services at a very low cost. And that would be a really, really significant thing for the world. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to try to do. It's not a well-developed idea, but I think it's an interesting approach to some of these issues.
Thank you. Drew Clark with BroadbandCensus.com, designed to track the availability, competition, speeds, and prices of broadband services. The last point you were making about managing a wireless space and auctions in real time almost started to sound like a notion of a band manager and having someone acquire the rights to spectrum and then serve as the auctioneer, licensor, sub-licensor, et cetera, of spectrum. I'm wondering whether that's something you would endorse, which would seem to go in the opposite direction towards the more property rights model of spectrum, and why you haven't addressed the more basic question as to why we even should allocate this remaining 298 megahertz towards broadcasters when so few people watch over-the-air television. Isn't there a way to buy the broadcasters off and free up all 500 megahertz of that spectrum?
Those are good questions. I think I'd be open to any of those things. We proposed doing some things like that. I don't think, if the government really wants the money up front, which is obviously a mistake, then you can pay them the money up front and have somebody else do the auction over time. And I think having a band manager, that bought some spectrum and then wholesale auctioned it would be a very positive thing. I think that would be a wonderful thing to have happen. Your second question was about broadcasters. I just assume that's like a pretty difficult political fight. If you were being practical about it, you clearly say, well, there's wires passing all the houses. We have actually satellite television, which is there's no incremental cost of adding a user basically at all. You just need to buy the dish, and the equipment, maybe a couple $100. And so if you took the 5 or 10% or whatever, 13%, he said, number of people who still watch TV that way, you could, it wouldn't cost you very much to buy them out. I think the issue, as I understand it, from the broadcasters, the must-carry provisions are really what they're after. And we have this kind of weird economic situation where, if you broadcast, then you're required to carry it on the cable systems, and that has a lot of economic value for the broadcasters, and they don't believe they would have that right if they no longer broadcast. So basically all that spectrum is just being used for that purpose, rather than for any kind of real spectral purpose. In fact, there's a TV station, I think in the Philadelphia area, that actually filed to turn off its analog broadcast because it cost them more money in electricity than they gained in advertising. So I understand that the FCC didn't let them do that. But they still had a digital broadcast which still maintained their must-carry provision. So they thought the analog broadcast was kind of worthless, but they weren't allowed to do that. So I do think that the broadcast spectrum that's out there does have kind of questionable value from an engineering perspective, but from a political perspective and from the way these things are structured, it has a lot of value to the broadcasters. I don't know how you fix that. You guys are all in DC, so I think that's a difficult political problem.
Yeah, definitely. I should, as a footnote, note that back when John McCain was chairman of the Commerce Committee, we proposed that very thing. I think the original proposal was that the first increment of this 700 megahertz spectrum auction that would come before a hard deadline, before a turnoff, would go to buy everyone relying on over the air, not a converter box, but rather their choice of either a satellite dish or a cable set-top. In other words, the government would set them up with a subscription provider. But it was just a bridge too far politically, even for McCain, to support it. Instead, he supported the converter box option, which didn't get into the must-carry problem that Larry mentioned.
We should say to him, the basic issue is you don't watch TV while you're mobile very often. I mean, the amount of uses of that is so small, and you could accommodate those using other kinds of spectrum, direct broadcast to that particular individual, through more like a cellular system or something like that, where you're able to reuse the spectrum. I mean, the basic issue, let me just go up a level for a second. The basic issue we have for spectrum is that, we don't want to use spectrum. There's no value in using or not using spectrum. What we want to do is we want to move information around, and that's represented in the spectrum. And to do that, you want to move the most amount of information as efficiently as possible. And given that we have the internet now, the internet's actually pretty good for moving information. It doesn't use any spectrum, basically. You have a cable, you have fiber running to this room probably anyways. Why aren't you using that fiber instead of the spectrum? And so what you want to do is you want to use the internet for as much as possible, and then you want to use spectrum for that last little bit. And if you do that, you get to reuse all the spectrum over and over again, because you're only using it for, a short distance. In a populated area, you're only going to use it for hundreds of feet, probably, until you get to the nearest internet connection. If you do that, you'll have much more efficient use of spectrum. And your things like, if you're mobile when you're using your TV, you'll use spectrum for that TV. But if you're sitting at home, you should be using the internet and fiber or whatever the hardwired thing is, not the spectrum. And so that's the ultimate transition, but that's obviously going to take a long time, and there's lots and lots of issues. But if you were an engineer and you sat down today and you said, I want to design our communications infrastructure, you would say I would use wires for as much as I possibly can, wires and fiber, hardwired things, for all the uses that can be used for that. And then for that last little bit, I'll use spectrum, and I'll use whatever spectrum is available, and I'll use it in as small an area as possible at the lowest possible powers, so I interfere with the least number of people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to take us out there. Yeah. Tim Carr, I believe.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Tim Carr with Free Press. The OECD recently updated its international rankings of the 30 member nations, and it had the United States in broadband access and penetration falling from 12th place, I believe, at the end of 2006 to 15th at the end of 2007. And my question is from a business perspective, a company that does business in a lot of the other countries that have been leading this ranking, places like South Korea, the Netherlands, and so forth. Do you see a real economic impact of this sort of declining status of U.S. Broadband services?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I already mentioned, I actually have numbers, we went from like third in something like 2001, I think. But yeah, absolutely, we see that. And in fact, like I said, I mean, the U.S., which you would think, you know, would be the highest monetization place, is eclipsed by the U.K. Pretty significantly. And I think that's because of the better broadband services and more penetration of the internet and businesses and so on. They're just doing a better job. And there's many countries where that's true. I mean, there's many places where you can buy, you know, besides Washington D.C., where you have your own kind of broadband bubble. But in most of the U.S., it's really hard to get like a 100 megabit connection. There's like no way to do it at all. It's possible in D.C., but that's because you're in D.C. But in many countries, it's very easy to get that anywhere in the country. So I think, you know, we're pretty far behind, and you know, for us, it's a big problem because we have our main headquarters and so on in the U.S., and you know, our employees have, you know, 1 megabit kind of service. And if we're thinking about building, you know, the next generation of internet services, they're not going to be 1 megabit services. They're going to be 100 megabit services, and we're not going to end up developing those because our employees aren't going to realize that they can do that because they don't have those connections. So in terms of us being competitive, I think it's very, very important for us to be leading that rather than following it. And we show no signs of being able to do that. I actually, like, there's some pretty crazy proposals that I actually like, one of which is the tubes proposal. We know that the internet is made of tubes, and but it actually really is made of tubes. And in fact, you know, when we wire up our buildings, we have a whole bunch of buildings in our headquarters. You know, we have tubes running between the buildings, and we have rights to use those tubes. And whenever we want, it's like an hour-long process. We just run a new fiber through one of the tubes. And there's already a wire running through, so you can pull the fiber through. They have a pull cord. So you pull the fiber through, and then all of a sudden, you know, you have another 10 gigabit connection. It costs you, you know, a few $1,000s. So that's a very, very efficient way to do things. And the problem we have is that we have all this coupling from our physical infrastructure, which is actually the tubes, and the wires. And the wires we actually want to replace, the wires and the fiber, we actually want to replace pretty often. It's like, you know, last year we had 1 gigabit Ethernet, now we have 10 gigabit Ethernet. You know, in a few years we'll have 100 gigabit Ethernet. But that's actually going to use a different kind of fiber probably than we have now. The types of fiber we have are changing, the types of wire we have are changing all the time. So what you want is an infrastructure that lets you easily replace all that equipment. You want to replace all the switches that are present in that infrastructure. And I think the best way to do this is, again, to decouple. It's kind of like the wireless example. You have somebody who's willing to auction you spectrum at any time. It'd be nice to have somebody willing to let you just use that tube at any time, and you pay, you know, some percentage of the space you're using in the tube. And somebody builds the tube, assuming somebody will buy space in it. And anybody can run through those tubes. And there's cities that have done this, and places that have done this very successfully. We have this deal with Mountain View. We have rights to run through their tubes, and we pay them for it. It's no big deal. But you know, the idea, which is sort of in the popular realm, that, you know, AT&T or Verizon is going to own the tube and the wire, I think it's not an efficient way to do it. You want whoever can provide the most efficient switching and transport infrastructure to provide that part, and whoever's the best at, you know, putting tubes through the ground to do that part.
I want to make a note to call John Stewart and tell him that Senator Stevens was actually right about the tubes.
Absolutely.
We have a web question.
Yeah, a couple good follow-ups there. You mentioned that you know, from an engineering standpoint, having a you know, using wiring fiber as much as possible makes sense, but there's always going to be this the need for the wireless. And so there were two questions going to that sort of wireless last mile. One of the online viewers named Michael Nelson asked, you know, what lessons should we learn from the recent collapse of a number of the municipal wireless initiatives? And you mentioned San Francisco earlier. And then someone from an organization called Move Pittsburgh asked if who would control the delivery method of access for the 700 megahertz spectrum? You know, is it, you know, repurposing the old television tower? Who's going to actually be the band manager, to use that term in a different way?
The media Wi-Fi thing, I mean, I think it works. You know, like again, I feel like our Mountain View network is very successful. Like I said, I think the issues are more regulatory and kind of like, you know, for us it was dealing with the guys who have the power and things like that, or finding where the poles really are and who owns them. And like San Francisco, actually, there are multiple owners of the poles, so you run into issues like that more than technical issues. I think technically these things work pretty well. But again, propagation is the main issue. How many radios do you need per square mile to get inside somebody's house? And that number is really high with 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi band. It's going to be much lower with 700 megahertz band, and that will help a lot.
Yeah, how about right here?
I'm Mark Brodsky from Public Knowledge, and first of all, I'd like to thank you and the company for your support of open internet. It's been a big help to all of us. Just wanted to go back, as I know we were sort of short on time at the press club lunches. They have sort of a last question thing, which is semi-serious but not totally serious. So we'll go back to that weekend when you were the high bidder in the C block. Did you have an oh my god moment, now what? And what would you have done with it had you actually won?
I mean, I don't know that we want to go into all the details there. I was excited about it. Because I feel like it was a reasonable price and we would find something good to do with it. But it's not our core business, and I'm also happy that, you know, if I could wave my hands and all of a sudden like all the right things happen with Spectrum and there was really good wireless high-speed access and really good wired broadband access and it was really open, like I would be really, really happy, you know, especially if I had nothing to do with it, because then I could do other things, right? So I think, you know, Google's up to a lot of stuff, and you know, we're only actually a medium-sized company. We have about 20,000 people in terms of headcount, and so it's actually, we have other things to do. Organizing the world's information is a big task. But if we're forced to do access, we will do it, and that's sort of the message we're sending, and that's how we feel about it. If no one else is going to do access, there's no point in us organizing information because nobody will have access to it. And so we're trading those things off. For us as a business, it would be better if there's a great environment that provides the openness, provides the access. And, you know, we don't have to do that part. It's like I said, we've got other things we can do. So I think that's our basic attitude about it. So, you know, a little bit of excitement, a little bit of, you know, but that is going to be something that we hadn't necessarily have to do. We might prefer not to.
We have time for maybe one or two more. I guess way in the back there.
Hi, sir. I'm Jason Brin from Fox Business. In the course of your talk, you've spoken about...
I don't think we can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jason Radke from Fox Business. In the course of your talk, you've spoken about, you know, open competition on devices, open internet, open wireless networks, open source on phone operating system, lots of openness. And I think there's probably a lot to be lauded in that. You also mentioned how more open internet also gives you increased revenues, increased access to the internet. There are some people who are concerned, though, that in terms of your technology, that using the Google technology in a pursuit to increase revenues through advertising with Yahoo, that there may actually be less openness in that, some antitrust concerns. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, so people probably are all aware of the Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, all the stuff going on. Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about the different kind of open things. We definitely feel very strongly that way, and part of the reason why we're pushing all this openness, open source kind of things is because we've lived in a closed world and we haven't liked it very well as computer scientists. So for example, like, you know, the Android, the phone operating system we're doing is totally and truly open. Like it's not the sun kind of open, it's really open. Where, you know, you can take that code and you can do whatever you want with it, you can release it in a product, and, you know, it's just, you can do whatever you want. It's totally open. And I think the reason we did that is that we don't like living sort of in a world where, you know, almost everybody in the world, 95% of people, 97% of the people in the world use one operating system that's totally closed and you can't change it or do anything with it. And so I think, part of it is a reaction to the regime that we live in. And we just feel like that would be a better world. So we have been very supportive of those things for personal reasons too. Like I said, as computer scientists, we like being in a world where we can innovate and do new things and so on. We're pretty concerned, I guess, the Yahoo-Microsoft merger would really close a lot of things that are really important. And I'll just give you one example, which is instant messaging. We've had an open interop for instant messaging for a long time. We said, whoever wants to interoperate with us with instant messaging, that would be great. We'll interoperate with you as long as you deal with spam and a few things to make it work. And it's amazing you can actually email anyone regardless of what company they use for their email, right? And the reason for that is that started in universities. It was an open protocol and it was designed to do that. Instant messaging originated in companies, or it got popularized through companies, and it got popularized in a closed way. You could only instant message within that network. And we don't like that. We just think that's stupid. That's being done for business reasons and doesn't help people in any way. It also doesn't foster competition. There's no way to make a better IM client or anything like that and have it work with anybody else. So if you want to have good products, you need to have some degree of openness. And we think we've put our money where our mouth is on all those things and pushed pretty hard for that. If Yahoo and Microsoft were to merge, they'd have something like 90% of all the communications market. We've worked hard on Gmail, things like that. It was controversial when we did it, because we had people in the company say, people are never going to switch their email addresses, it's too much work, and so on, and we shouldn't be doing that, it's just going to be a lot of work and never work. It's been working, but we've been gaining market share, but it takes a lot of time to do that. Somebody a little bit crazy like us to do it, right? Now, if you put 90% of the communications all in one company, I think that's a really big risk, especially one that has a history of doing bad stuff. So, for that reason, we're pretty concerned about that. Obviously, we do have a large advertising share and so on, but we also feel like there are ways in which to structure a deal with Yahoo that would be reasonable from that standpoint, especially given the alternatives that they have, which aren't great either. So I think, for us, Yahoo wants to remain independent. They've said that, basically said that. And we would support that. We think it's better to have more companies in that space and to not have really strong concentrations of certain areas. So, on the other hand, they're in a difficult situation. So.
Let's take one last question back, way in the back there. Harold.
Hi, Harold Feld, Media Access Project, and like some of my colleagues here, I also want to thank you for the very constructive role that you guys have been playing. And just on your last point, and in part to the constructive role that you guys have been doing, one of the reasons why email could be received by everybody is not just because it was developed in universities. That helps, but some of us also remember there used to be a protocol called Archie that was developed at a university, and then they tried to get greedy with it, and that shut it down. The difference was that there was actually a rule that the FCC put in place called the computer proceedings that opened up the phone network so that anybody could send email or sell email services. When it came time for instant messaging, and there were some people who were saying we ought to require instant messaging to be connected, everybody said, no, rules are bad. We should let companies develop this, keep everything closed and proprietary because that's going to make things work. And some of the biggest voices in that in the 90s were from the Silicon Valley companies. Do you guys have a sense that maybe there's a change in attitude that's happening, that sometimes you need government regulation to come in order to make sure that we do have everything open and we don't have a situation like we're seeing the difference between email and instant messaging, where you're going to get a bunch of these not interconnected situations, balkanization, rather than stuff that works together in concert for everybody?
I think ideally you'd have the threat of regulation that accomplished it. I mean, I do think that you end up, you might end up with interoperation that doesn't work well. Kind of like you have an email now where spam is still a big problem. People don't really interoperate in the right way to help deal with that issue. So, I'd be all for anything that made it happen. I do think for us, I mean, we just said that we're going to do things like that, and we try very hard to keep all those things very open and not keep people's data hostage and all these kind of things. And I think that it's good for our business to do that. Also, people understand that and they tend to use our services more. So, but if we can't accomplish it any other way, I think that would be fine. I'm not sure that's the case.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out this morning. Thank Larry for traveling here from California, taking the time. To all of you for your time. And please, if you're not on our list to be notified of events like this, please leave your card or something outside. And we have our International Summit for Community Wireless Networks next week, Thursday and Friday. If you're interested, there's cards and that are on our website. But thanks again, Larry, and to be continued.